The late 1970s were not kind to the Chrysler Corporation as it inched closer and closer to bankruptcy. The previous years saw numerous program planning blunders as well as quality issues that really sunk the reputation of Chrysler in the minds of consumers. It also didn't help that there were a number of product planning blunders, as previously mentioned, dating arguably back to the early 1960s when Plymouth introduced a lineup for 1962 that didn't really include a full-size car. It was also during this time period that Chrysler decided that its namesake make would not have anything other than full-size vehicles in its lineup. This decision really set the tone for Chrysler's product portfolio all the way through 1974. However, in 1973, the OPEC oil embargo had really hit Chrysler division hard, as the company only had full-size vehicles to sell that were perceived to be and were indeed gas guzzlers. The Chrysler lineup for 1974 contained more of the same that it did in 1973, though the styling was indeed different. The vehicles were similarly large in size and in fact heavier, in part due to the increased bumper standards, which now necessitated the use of large bumpers on both the front and rear of the vehicles. Chrysler knew that it needed a solution for its lineup, but really didn't have much in the pipeline, or at least so it initially thought. A solution, however, came in the form of a car that was in development within the Plymouth studios that was supposed to be known as the Premier or the Grand Era. It rode atop a 115-inch wheelbase and was meant to be a competitor to Chevrolet's Monte Carlo. Though the car was planned to be a Plymouth, Chrysler planners would soon choose to elevate this new vehicle from a Plymouth to a Chrysler and endow the Chrysler lineup with something that it hadn't seen in modern times, an intermediate-sized car. Fortunately, the Grand Era already had an upscale look to it with a long hood, short deck European-style profile, as well as a Jaguar-esque front end. All that was really left to do to turn this new intermediate into a Chrysler then was to upgrade the interior and throw a few more pieces of badging and doodads like opera lamps on the side of the vehicle, and thus the Cordoba was born. It was an instant hit for Chrysler Corporation, and in 1975, its initial model year sold over 150,000 units. However, Dodge also wanted to get into the party and introduced a sister model to the Cordoba, the Dodge Charger. Now, this wasn't the Charger that you and I would typically think of, or an auto enthusiast would think of, something along the lines of the car that was in the movie Bullitt, chasing Steve McQueen's Mustang Fastback. The Charger by this point had been relegated to, as I mentioned, an intermediate-sized platform, and this particular 1975 Dodge Charger was almost indistinguishable from the Chrysler Cordoba. It had a similar front end, had a little bit different grille texture, different trim, but for all purposes, it really was a badge-engineered Cordoba, and really a badly badge-engineered Cordoba at that. As a result, the Dodge Charger was consequently invisible to almost everyone in the marketplace, including all buyers, as only 31,000 copies of the 1975 Charger were sold compared to the previously mentioned 150,000 plus units of the Chrysler division's Cordoba. For 1976, Dodge tried to put a little bit different spin on the Charger, now having 4 different trim variations of the Charger: the Base, the Sport, the SE, and the Daytona, but it still really didn't help, although sales did improve versus the 1975 model. Dodge really wanted its own intermediate-sized car with a distinct identity that could stand on its own and also compete in the marketplace. It unfortunately took several years, but eventually Dodge got its own distinct intermediate that it could be proud of, and that was the Dodge Magnum. Prior to the Magnum's launch, however, Dodge had to finish the designs of a number of other mainstream vehicles, including the Dodge Aspen in 1976 and the Diplomat in 1977. Given Chrysler's scant resources, it thus took them until 1978 to launch the Magnum, although they certainly wanted to bring something to market sooner. If you ask most designers what the most distinctive element of a car is and should be, they'll often say the front end. And thus, the 1978 Dodge Magnum certainly got a front end that looked very different from the Cordoba and was unique in the marketplace. Kind of borrowed a little bit from the original Cord coffin nose styling with a prominent center grille and hood. However you want to describe it, the Dodge Magnum front end certainly didn't look like the Cordoba's front end. And I think one of the nice touches is that the grille had these rather thin blades that divided the grille section into four pieces, and that bottom section carried down underneath the headlamps and wrapped around the front fender. Another prominent feature of the Magnum front end were its headlights, which hid behind a clear polycarbonate door on either side, which, yes, did move out of the way when you turn the headlights on. This was mainly due to a series of U.S. state and federal regulations that mandated that the headlights must be exposed when turned on, and so they did indeed on the Dodge Magnum, as well as a sister vehicle, a four-door Dodge St. Regis. Now, clear polycarbonate headlamp doors, you say, well, why not body color? And body color was indeed quite typical during the time, not just for Chrysler, but for Ford as well as General Motors. Although Chrysler did try some other interesting hidden headlamp treatments, including that which was employed on the 1966 Dodge Charger, which perhaps is even one of the most beautiful hidden headlamp treatments of all time. In any case, this translucent clear polycarbonate headlamp door had been tried before by Chrysler, actually on the 1965 Imperial. But on that particular car, it did not move out of the way like it did on the 1978 and 1979 Dodge Magnum, where designers were really trying to endow the car with a look not dissimilar to what would come just a few years later when Lincoln pioneered the use of plastic headlamp covers and went away from sealed beams on the 1984 Mark VII. Remember, at this point, sealed beam headlamps were still required by federal safety standards to be used on vehicles. Thus, companies did not put anything other than sealed beam headlights on their cars at this point in time. From a finance person's perspective, you can imagine that these clear polycarbonate lenses certainly cost quite a bit, but at least Chrysler got their money's worth out of them, as they were reused on the Dodge St. Regis sedan, which lasted from 1979 to 1981. And I must say that overall, the Magnum was really quite an expensive redo of the Cordoba's design, where the hood wasn't shared, the front fascia wasn't shared, the front fenders even, though they look similar, are different. You can notice the difference if you look at the leading edge of the Dodge front fender and compare it to the Cordoba. The Cordoba's front fender's leading edge is much more vertical compared to this beautiful lead-in that the Dodge has. The doors were also different, as the sheet metal out back was also different. So really not too much was shared from a styling standpoint between the Cordoba and the Dodge Magnum. Unfortunately, while the Magnum looked athletic, under hood it really didn't have much to write home about. Standard was a 140 horsepower 318 two-barrel V8. Optional were a 360 cubic inch 155 horsepower V8 and 190 horsepower 400 cubic inch V8. So nothing really broke the 200 horsepower barrier for the Dodge Magnum, although these engines did have a fair amount of torque. Many were unfortunately endowed with Chrysler's lean burn setup, which did exactly what its name mentioned, and that is strove for an air-to-fuel ratio of about 18-1 versus an optimal 14-15-1 in order to curb emissions. The setup was developed by Chrysler's Huntsville, Alabama electronics division, the same group that worked on a number of space programs for NASA. But despite having put men on the moon, they couldn't quite get this lean burn correct. And in fact, it would be the same Chrysler Huntsville division that would engineer the ill-fated fuel injection system in the 1981 to 83 Imperial. Because of the lean burn or because of the emissions, even Magnums equipped with a 400 cubic inch V8 took about 11 seconds to go from 0 to 60, so was quite leisurely. Although, while the engines under hood weren't all that cool, you certainly could get some cool two-tone paint schemes for your Magnum and even T-tops. Overall, the Dodge Magnum was kind of a cool refresh of the Cordoba, and I think one of those underappreciated classic vehicles that many have just forgotten about. In any case, wanted to make sure that we featured it here for the Mopar fans. Hope you enjoyed this spotlight on the 1978-79 Dodge Magnum. If you did, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, but check out the video thumbnails at bottom left and right for some suggestions for you. Thanks again for watching.